Welcome to Theological Table Talk, the podcast for the Center for Christian Studies. My name is Keith Stanglin. I'm the director of the Center for Christian Studies. I'm joined, as always, by Todd Hall, the associate director of the Center for Christian Studies. And on today's podcast, we want to talk about something that may not be too edifying when you hear it at first, but I think you're really going to get a lot out of this discussion. And in short, it is the topic of funerals. So I note that funerals is one of those things that even if, in death, of course, is something that we don't want to talk about. We would rather avoid this topic, maybe at all costs. But it's also something that is totally relevant because last time I checked, the mortality rate stays pretty steady at 100%.
Yes.
And like taxes, right? It's inevitable. And so there's a relevancy to the topic that you don't get actually with too many other topics.
Yeah.
Other topics, I think people can listen, to the theme or what it is and say, I don't know if that's really relevant to me. Death is.
Yeah.
So that, for one thing, is one reason we want to talk about this. So
Yeah.
glad you're here, Todd, and here to talk about this.
Me too. I'm excited.
Yeah, good. Yeah. So one reason we want to talk about this also is because the recent issue of our journal, the Journal of Christian Studies, was on this theme of, I actually called it the art of dying, which is a phrase that goes back many centuries in the history of the church, when Christians and Christian theologians and ministers would, I would say they were a little less hesitant than we are to talk about something, though, like death, though it's never been a pleasant thing to discuss. They were more open, I think, to talking about preparation for death.
Yeah.
And the art of dying was really a genre that helped people think about and reflect on this.
Yeah. It was more present for them. It's funny. Our former colleague Stephen Lawson has a piece in that latest issue of the journal that's very good, and I think he'll be on sometime soon. But one of the things that he points out is that we moderners see thousands of deaths every year, but they're all on screen.
They mean nothing.
Yeah, they're not real, yes. At all. Whereas for them, it was a present reality all the time.
We it's sort of glamorized. I think of like the Marvel Comics movies where thousands of people are dying, and I think of also actually the original Star Wars movie. Like Alderaan was destroyed there, and Princess Leia watches. This whole planet is destroyed, and you kind of, maybe that was the first in movies where you really get desensitized to just like mass scale killing, but you're not connected to any of these lives, and in that sense it's removed, you're desensitized to it. And I've observed this with my kids a lot over the years. When you watch a movie, like a Marvel Comics movie, and how many you saw 10,000 people or whatever just die in that when that city exploded or whatever it was, and then you watch a well done movie. Yes, I'm saying those mostly are not well done. You're watching a well done movie where there's a character that you connect with, and they actually take the time to build sympathy with that character, and they die. Then you feel a connection there just with one death that you didn't feel when that was multiplied by tens of thousands.
Yeah, interesting.
So we have it there in front of us in a sort of fake way in Hollywood.
And virtual.
But then we outsource it a lot when it comes to the dying that we cannot avoid, our own or those close to us, of course.
Yeah.
We do our best to outsource it to healthcare facilities, to other caretakers, and then to funeral homes. I'm not saying there's anything bad about this, but it's just the way we do it. And it's very different than the way humans have done it, as long as there have been there's been human civilization, or just humans for that matter. It's been a very close thing, and I should say, a part of life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, so we did that journal on this whole topic was on the art of dying, and Todd, you wrote also an article in that, and I just wanted to maybe pick your brain a little bit about that article. Certainly, we want to, in some ways, plug that piece and that whole issue, because I think it is very helpful to Christians, and particularly to church leaders who deal not only with death in their own family, but are in some ways connected to any death that happens in the church.
Yeah, and I want to say, I mean, just for a second, we promise not to do advertising very often, but if you don't subscribe to the journal, you really should. What we want to do with the journal really is this kind of thing, to explore important topics using good scholarship that is accessible. And I think Keith is the editor of the journal and does a great job of keeping it relevant and good in that way. And so maybe you could just talk for a second about what in the world, how do we write on death? Where did that come from?
Yeah, well, as I think back, why did we choose this as a topic? When we edited this previous journal, Christian Studies, which in some ways was a predecessor to the Journal of Christian Studies here, new journal, we did the sacraments of baptism and Eucharist. So we did a whole issue devoted to baptism, a whole other issue devoted to the Lord's Supper. And I remember saying at the time, well, why don't we just do the traditional, in the Western Catholic Church, also Eastern Orthodoxy for that matter, 7 sacraments. We've done 2 of them here. Those could be good topics. And so we did one that was related to sexuality and marriage. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of getting in the marriage or matrimony sacrament there. We have not done anything yet on the chrismation or confirmation, whatever you think of that. But there are ways that we can do that. Even as Protestants, we don't think of these as sacraments. Yeah. But these are at least practices of the church, right? That are very important. So we're going to do one later on ordination and church leadership and ministry. But then the sacrament of last anointing, which is just anointing of the sick, is where that comes from. It's a practice we see in James 5, especially, that if someone is sick, the elders come and anoint that person and pray for them, and they will be healed, it says. So it's not necessarily a sacrament of dying, but that's what it has come to be in the development of church history. And it is obviously a rite of passage. So for it to have a sacrament devoted to it, or a church practice, let's say, devoted to it, says something right there that it's something worth talking about. Yeah. Even if we don't regard it as a sacrament. As Protestants, it's something worth reflecting on. There may be something of importance there. And I think that's what we found. I know I thought I was a little hesitant to say, let's do a whole journal issue on dying. But, as I thought about it more, and as the article started coming together and we got some good contributors for it, it made sense. I'm glad we did it.
Yeah. And the response has been interesting. I've had a few responses that have been very positive, and I know you have as well. So yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah, it's just conversations that, again, we don't have often in churches. Who's having these conversations on a somewhat deep level? And so, well, we are. If no one else is, we're having them, and that's what this podcast also is about today. So good. Yeah. So what I'm wondering, Todd, what made you want to write this article besides we needed an article for this issue? You're managing editor and associate director of the center. So besides me asking you to write an article, what made you want to write this article? Sort of, what's it about?
Yeah. So actually, it was a good segue from what we were just talking about, because you're right. People in churches don't talk about this. And so I've seen, over the past couple of decades, really, but it's become much more common in the last 5 or 6 years, the just total transformation of the way the church does a funeral. It's not even really a funeral anymore. And so I saw that. I have it, I started back into ministry in 2018, and I've had the blessing and curse of doing several funerals and attending several funerals. And I just, in seeing how those went, there was a real truth. I think Tom Long says that you're more likely to hear laughter than weeping at funerals now. And I think there's something there that I wanted to explore and understand why the change is happening, why it's accelerating. I wanted to explore, and I didn't get a chance to do much of this. Stephen does more in his article than I do, but with the switch from burial to cremation and how those things might be interlinked with one another. And so that was sort of the long-term goal when we started talking about doing this. I thought, yeah, that sounds interesting. We need to think about funerals. And the church needs to think about funerals, because we are just changing what we do. And I don't think anyone's really thinking about why we do what we do. I've attended a couple of services for folks who were not in any way affiliated with a church and weren't Christian, and I've attended Christian celebrations of life, and they're remarkably similar. And I wonder why that is. And so that was the long-term interest. And then also, my dad's been sick for a long time. He started really declining back in, January, February. And so part of what this article is for me is a working out of what his funeral would look like, because I needed to think through. I did not want to do a celebration of life. And looking at the funerals that I had done prior to his funeral, there's a lot of eulogy, not a lot of worship. I mean, it was always very Christian, but I wanted to think through what would it look like to have a funeral, a truly Christian funeral. And so, watching Paul Scalia's funeral for his father, and I was very moved by that. And then just looking into kind of the history of funerals with Tom Long and all those. That was kind of behind that.
Good. Yeah. So what do you think, you sort of touched on this a little bit, but what do you think the purpose of a funeral is?
Yeah, it's funny. I have you read Tom Long's book, The Accompany Them with Singing?
No, I know it, but I've not.
It's fantastic. But he does start with, look, it's actually a very practical concern.
Yeah.
There's a dead body. Something needs to be done with it. And that's kind of the beginning of it all, and so there's this sort of sociological function that is at base just what do we do with this body? And
humans have always done something
with
the body,
yeah.
Right? Animals don't.
Right.
Usually, if ever, that
yeah.
I know of.
I think that's right.
They just sort of leave it
yeah.
and go on.
Yeah. Let the buzzards come.
Yeah. But humans haven't done that.
Yeah.
And the equivalent today would be putting it in the trash.
Right.
Yeah. And the dump or whatever.
Recycling.
We usually don't do that either.
Yeah, there's some weird things going on now. Have you seen you can buy like a tree pod or something and you bury the body in that? It's I don't know. We're really weird. It's a stupid time to be alive.
Yeah, but still, it's different.
Something's being done.
There's something deliberate and intentional being done.
And I think that's really, actually Dad wrote a paper when he was in medical school on funeral practices around the world that I read years ago, and just different cultural, but there's always some kind of funeral. You can see that for those who are in ministry or like social work and stuff, probably have seen, you'll do a funeral for a homeless person who doesn't have a family, maybe doesn't even have friends. They're just alone, but still we're unwilling to just bury someone. The social workers or caretakers or the states, they always want to have some kind of service. Because
someone has to say a few words.
Always,
yeah,
always. And but it's interesting because it's just this moment where, as a community, you're recognizing the passing of something precious, something I would say sacred. And I think even your average secularist would say this is something sacred. There was a human life that's now not here anymore, and so. The funeral provides this the sociological function of having kind of a rite of passage to it. In the same way that when I wrote on baptism is this moment of transition where you can always point back and say, at what point did I become a Christian? Well, it was that point, right? Or at what point did I become married? Well, it was that point.
Yeah.
And I think the funeral does that same thing. Sociologically, and it ought, and so therefore it's very important because it does a lot of heavy lifting for a community. It serves as kind of a constant reminder of the specialness, I would say, sacredness of human life, and it's just sort of recognized that you ought to say a few words. You ought to, when someone dies, and so I think that's really important.
Would you say that this is also some sort of closure for the community, for the family and friends? I don't know if that word, it doesn't mean maybe what we think it means, right? In some ways, but there is. I mean, just when you put into an objective moment, like a wedding, like a baptism. There is this objective moment where there's something sealed there.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe not emotional closure,
right?
In the sense that we usually think of it, because usually that's when grief really begins. But not always. But yeah, there's a sense in which it's sort of a wrapping up. It's the conclusion to a particular story. So yeah.
Good. Is there any? So there's a sociological function. I think we have invested that with theological meaning, also, and all cultures have. But the theological meaning for us, maybe I'm thinking especially of burial versus cremation, but maybe other things going on there that we take this practice that all humans have always done and make something, I don't know, Christian out of it. It's a time to proclaim the gospel. It's a time just like death and the awareness of death is a reminder of what's most important in life. I just see all kinds of opportunities there for the community to be reminded and even instructed about what it is we believe that we often now neglect.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah. It's fascinating. I was reading Tom Long's book. I actually heard an interview, I think he was on with Ken Myers years ago when the book came out. And he said that he had set out to write a book that was kind of in praise of the celebration of life, shifting to the celebration of life. And so he set out and started researching and looking what the early church did, and ended up having to scrap what he had written and start over and write a different book. And it was the way that Christians had invested this moment with deep, deep theological meaning, that it was, other people had services. Obviously, Jews had burial as well. The Romans burned, but the Jews buried. And so you have that, but this was a specifically Christianization of other funerals. He also says somewhere in there that we often think of the catacombs as a place where Christians would go to hide, to worship, that sort of thing. But that actually the catacombs were sort of the first Christian artifact in a sense. That's they were Christian places of burial because the Romans didn't bury. So, you have this really interesting development of a respect for the human body, a respect for human life as the creation of God. And then in terms of Christianizing it, the funeral is that moment of investing this person's life with the meaning of the gospel, in a sense. And so, I've been to some Christian funerals even where I never heard the gospel except for maybe a couple of the songs that were sung. And, of course, those are hit or miss depending on what songs are being sung or played. And so, you think what a drastic change that is, because this person's life, I mean, if we're honest about it, from a Christian point of view, there's no meaning to any particular human life unless that life is invested with the meaning of the gospel. Because if there is no life after this life, if there's no, we can rage on as all that we want against the abyss, but that doesn't make it go away. And the simple fact of the matter is, none of us will be remembered within a generation of our death. And if the gospel is not what we have to hope in, then we don't have any hope. And this is Paul's whole point, I think, in 1 Corinthians 15. And so, this is why a funeral is so, in the early church, it becomes a moment not so much of a funeral. I mean, it is a funeral, but it's more like a service of worship. And that worship goes on as the church worships, because this person becomes a part of the story of the church. And their life then is invested with that deep meaning of the gospel, and that carries on. And I think that is where I'm most disturbed about kind of changes in funeral practices, because the funeral ought to be about one life, and that life is Jesus. And then our lives are placed in the context of that life, because that life is what gives meaning to every other life ever lived. So,
I like that way of putting it there. Certainly, death and irrelevance are coming to all of us, and so that's a good reminder there that there's only one thing that gives it relevance and lasting significance, and that is Christ. And so, why would you have a funeral service for a Christian that never mentions Christ?
Right.
Is what exactly about the Christ event in person that makes it significant is his death and resurrection. Ultimately, the incarnation, the whole package, I think. But, I was at a funeral recently, a couple months ago, of an older relative that I had not met in person, but I accompanied my parents there. And this was a man who had been an elder in the church for many, many decades, and was a pillar in that congregation. And his funeral service, you had a couple of family members talking about some good memories, but no one said anything about the resurrection. No one read scripture. So we sang a few songs. It was more of the miss than it was the hit, in the hit or miss category there. And then maybe just a couple of songs. And then one preacher, I guess, got up. His task was to say a prayer. He prefaced it with the reading of a psalm. And so it was almost accidental that we heard scripture read. And you leave that thing and kind of think, well, that was nice. If you're not reflective, then you start reflecting on it and saying, well, what was that? That was did it even communicate to people what we think was the most important thing in this man's life? It didn't really. And so I contrast that with your dad's funeral just a few weeks ago, where you officiated, and there were good songs, I think, but very good words about him, but ultimately about God and what He's done for us in Christ. And then also just so there's a worship context to it. And then at the end, talking about his joining the martyrs and saints in worship. So there's a lot more beauty, I think, to just putting it in a theological context.
Yeah. So, I also think just, pragmatically, let me be very pragmatic. But, let's say if you're in ministry, sometimes you're going to get asked to do a funeral for somebody that you've never known. And frankly, a lot of times these folks have outlived all of their friends and family. Yeah. And so, when I first started in ministry way back when, we had like a class on conducting a funeral, and the biggest advice was go out and talk to the family and gather stories,
right.
Which is, good advice. But, man, I have found, for instance, at the gravesite, even at my dad's service, I just opened the Book of Common Prayer and read 3 paragraphs and the 23rd Psalm. And these are words that have been spoken over the graves of millions of saints for years. And he is now among that company. And so, I think that's a huge advantage to this. Look, Christians have been doing this for a while, and I'm not saying there can't be innovation, but we ought to innovate in the right direction, This is the thing.
Right.
Instead of going the wrong direction.
Yeah. That's good. I remember a funeral that I attended for a friend. It's been well over a decade ago, but it made such an impression on me, probably 15 years ago. He was ex-military, and so he was a young man when he died, and there was a funeral at the church building, and we had people, including an atheist who was a friend, get up and say nice things about the guy, and that was nice. People were laughing, and like I said, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
We had a few praise and worship songs that were congregational, and so everybody sang, 3 or 4 of those songs. I would put, again, more in the miss category, hit or miss there, but that's fine. There are some good songs written in the last 10 years, I suppose. We didn't sing any of them, but and then we made the trek to where he was because of the nature of the accident, he was cremated. And so we went to where the ashes were going to be scattered. And there you have, on the way, fire trucks holding the American flag, and police and firemen and lining the streets.
Yeah, standing at attention.
And you start thinking, now I'm starting to be emotionally moved. Not with the things we had just been through in the so-called funeral, but now it's starting like there's symbols here that are lasting, that have been a part of, as you say, millions of other funerals, and there's something bigger than just this kind of going on here. And then we went to the site, and you get the 21 gun salute. It was done really well. The flag was folded, and words spoken to the widow as the flag is being given to her. And again, these are words. And then taps. Everybody knows what's coming. It's a liturgy.
Yeah.
Really a liturgical form there. It's nothing unique to this person, but that's what actually made it moving. So when I looked around, that's when people were emotionally moved.
Yeah.
Was the 21 gun salute and taps. And none of it was unique. None of it was innovated on the spot. And that's why actually it ended up being moving. So I just thought this is the same way with liturgy in any worship
Exactly.
setting. But particularly in a funeral, is that why are we moved most by a secular, and this is a secular, the political liturgy.
Yeah.
Why is that the most moving thing in a funeral? It doesn't have to be. It was.
Yeah.
And I'm thankful that it was there, because otherwise it would feel like we didn't really mourn a loss here, or have that kind of closure, or take it seriously in some ways.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I want to say also, so that the church did that. We built this liturgy over the millennia, and you went through it, but it was so suffused with the gospel and with Scripture, and that's what's key. But I want to say also, it's not the time for evangelism, because I've seen that too at a couple of funerals. That so and so is in heaven, and don't you want to be too? And there's kind of this altar call. I've seen that in some, and I don't think it's the place for that. I'm not sure what the place for that actually is, but I think that part of it is just trust the gospel. Right, and what you're proclaiming is, and this is what we tried to do at Dad's funeral, is just look, the gospel speaks for itself. Jesus saying, "I am the way and the truth and the life," speaks for itself. Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 15, they speak for itself. So surround what you do with Scripture, with the gospel, and you don't have to. I know that I've heard it said, this is a time when you can really make an impact in people's lives, so you better be ready with your gospel sermon. It's true that the funeral is a unique moment that opens people's hearts to something deeper. Mm-hmm. But you don't want to come off as a used car salesman. Don't manipulate grief to save souls.
Right.
Let the gospel do its job. And and it will, trust it. It'll do it every time.
Yeah. Maybe we've already touched on this, but back to this funeral versus celebration of life. Mm-hmm. Why is the funeral? Well, first, what do we mean by celebration of life?
Yeah.
Can you give me a one sentence or two definition of that?
Probably
and it will be in contrast to funeral,
I
suppose. But what do we mean by that?
Yeah, well, it's the where we get together and we remember the good times with this person, or the good person, what the good things that this person did, that sort of thing, as opposed to, the traditional funeral. I hadn't realized until I read Stephen's article that the funeral liturgy for the Roman Catholic Church still does not allow a eulogy. Which I think is incredible, actually, and it goes back to. What you were talking about there with the graveside by the military. They don't eulogize this person. They have some beautiful words that they offer to the bereaved, but it's a pretty standard thing, and yet it is far more moving, than getting together and talking about the good things that this person did or whatever.
So Larry was a good guy, and boy, he had a lot of adventures.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
He had a good time.
He had a good time. Well, and it's funny, what happens if Larry wasn't a good guy? That's
right.
I once heard there was a funeral at a church here around years ago, and the guy who passed was just a jerk, a really bad guy. And the preacher got up and said, "So-and-so was a mean man."
Yeah, you don't hear that too much.
No.
But yeah, sometimes that comes out. I have a friend who's a minister who did a funeral recently, and he only knew the old man as a very old man for the last few years of his life. And when the family got together, then it all came out what a mean cuss this guy was his whole life. Most of the family was relieved finally. So those things can happen too. But yeah, what do you get up and does no one a service to get up and lie about this person, and in fact might do the gospel a disservice. It goes back to your point, no one's individual significance is how good or bad they were, actually. It's the significance of being saved by God's grace.
Yeah.
So that's the celebration of life. why is the funeral it is being replaced?
Yeah.
The funeral is being replaced by the celebration of life. Why is that happening?
Yeah, that's interesting. In the article, I've got some quotes from a couple of funeral homes that make it really clear that the celebration of life is replacing the funeral. That a relatively small percentage of actual funerals now, and an even smaller percentage of what we used to call viewings, sometimes visitation, and that sort of thing. Why is it replacing? Well, I think the celebration of life is the perfect service for our contemporary age. I mean, it just fits very well with an extremely secularized, self-driven, self-interested society, right? So what we want to do is get together, and we still have to have some sort of service to say goodbye to this person, but we don't have the freight of Christian belief anymore. And so basically, what is the meaning? What's the purpose of life? Well, it's to be a good person and to have a good time. I do think it's interesting. Dallas Willard points out that, if you want to know what people really think a good life is, a well-lived life, you should read obituaries. Nobody ever says, she had great teeth and beautiful hair, or whatever. Yeah. It's always, this was a good person who helped other people. And, so, but, in this, we've got, in the article, I'm not going to go through all that, but you go back to where sort of reason replaces in its own mind religion and superstition and things like that, and you move through into this age where we don't have any sense of the transcendent at all. There's really, for us, very few things sacred. I would say that death was one of those until the last few years, and now it's also beginning to become vulgarized. Just nothing sacred to it at all.
Yeah. So I think that's exactly right. In short, the funeral is a religious service.
Yeah.
This is how also I would describe it. And the celebration
that's how
of life is not.
Those funeral homes describe it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the celebration of life is not. And then you might run, if it's in a church, you might mention Jesus or something, or this person's with God now, but not really like the hope of the resurrection or what this faith means for us. As you say, again, what gives lasting significance to this individual life. So, part of that also is in the, let's say, desacralization of life, but also of death as well, is moving it out of the church building too. So just like with weddings, we don't want to do it in a church building. We want a venue. Well, we have a venue now for if we do a funeral at all. It's often in a funeral home or whatever. I really appreciated just the opportunity to at your dad's funeral to sing songs of worship in the place where he did this. And his body is there, and it's meaningful. This is a sacred space.
It is,
and sacred things happening here that are meaningful and good significance to all of us.
I think there's just this kind of general irreverence about everything now. And look, I'm as guilty of this as everybody else, but when I was younger, people talked about, don't wear a suit to church because you'll make people who can't afford a suit not, they'll feel bad, or you're just trying to look good or whatever it is, and I always remember my grandfather. He was a plant worker for Union Carbide, so not a wealthy man by any stretch, and he had 2 suits, one for weddings and funerals and one that he'd wear to church every Sunday. And the reason why he wore the suit every Sunday was because it was the Lord's Day, and you always brought your best to the Lord. Now that, so if you don't have a suit, that's fine. Bring your jeans without holes in them or whatever it is, But we've gone kind of the opposite direction now. I'm always surprised when I see a pastor preaching in a suit now. It's almost always, Birkenstocks and
Yes.
that kind of thing.
It's the vestments now.
Right, yeah, the new vestments, that's right. And not as good as the old vestments, man. Just not. But, yeah, I think that creeps into funerals. There's this kind of informality to it now. It's irreverent. It's in the celebration of life. We can tell jokes at the deceased's expense if we want to. It's fine, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I want to circle back and say there are some things I think that we can take from the celebration of life, but in general, that's not what the church ought to be about. First of all, the body is not even present at most funerals. There's a difference between a celebration of life and a memorial service, right? A memorial service is more specifically Christian, but in general, it's done because of cremation. And the body is not present. A funeral, really, by definition, has the body present. And we're the first people in history, Long says, that the deceased is not invited to their own funeral. And part of that is our utter and complete fear of death as a culture. That's why I think we surround ourselves with so much death on TV. Or the movies, or whatever it is that you do, because we're terrified of death, and we want death as far away from us as we can get it. We don't want to be around people who grieve. That's one of the things that I teach about is grief, and a lot of times it's okay, you can grieve for a couple of weeks, but after that, I'm going to need you to step up and soldier up. And I really think all that goes back to we're just terrified of death, and so when we get together and for Christians, the pernicious thing is we can justify the celebration of life by saying, well, we don't have to be afraid of death, right? And so,
death has been swallowed up in life.
Right, and so that's why we're celebrating, not grieving, not having a funeral, which is not true. I mean, it's just simply not true. Death is defeated. Death is still an enemy. It's still unnatural. It's still not what we were made for. And I think humans instinctively know that. That's why we bury our dead. That's why, those kinds of things. And so we kind of deny that, with the celebration of life stuff, that God has overcome death, yes, ultimately. But people are still dying, and there's still life to be lived and death to be died.
So the saying from Paul that we don't grieve like those without hope doesn't mean we don't grieve.
Right, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times people do think that's what that means.
Okay.
Or for whatever reason.
It's interesting to me, it's sort of ironic that the church has recovered lament also, or at least we talk about it. This is a good thing it's appropriate in worship. We know there are psalms of lament that we need to reappropriate for ourselves, and we should be comfortable bringing our complaints and our lament and weeping to God. But as we say that, we are increasingly finding it uncomfortable to grieve at a funeral.
Yeah.
We want to laugh and celebrate life only. And it seems like we want to say the same thing we do about worship, is that worship can encompass many emotions.
Yeah.
There can be joy and laughter, I think, at a funeral. And I don't know, I just feel like at mine, there will be laughing at my expense also.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing all the time, I mean, but yeah, if that's all it is, which is kind of what we have now.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's problematic.
Is there anything good about celebration of life? I mean, I kind of want to say there's a balance there, sort of like with worship. If it's all lament,
you're right.
You're missing something important there about the joy and the hope that come through Christ and the resurrection. If it's all what is it, sing and be happy today,
right?
Then you're sort of missing out on something really important about the gospel as well.
Absolutely.
And the cross.
Yeah.
So is there a place maybe is the celebration of life in a Christian context sort of a maybe overreaction in some ways to the funerals that didn't ever talk about somebody, or were just an altar call, or some sort of misuse of it?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think so. I mean, I do think that one of the things that Long says is somewhere in the Middle Ages, you could go through a funeral service without talking about the deceased. So for us, we don't want them present. For them, they didn't even talk about them, in the liturgy. So there is the funeral is a commendation of this particular saint to God. It's also a moment of a rite of passage for the family who are going through this. And I think that what the celebration of life can teach us is that, this person matters, and this family needs to know that this person matters to other people as well. And so that's why, I think incorporating things about this person in the context of the gospel and what Christ has done in and through this person, we can incorporate some of this celebration of life activities while not, going down the rabbit hole of just being a celebration of this person's life. And I think that's probably really important. So it's a balance. I'm not saying it's an easy thing. I suppose it probably was easier when all you had was the prayer book and you could just go through that and, not mention the person at all. But no, I think there's something incarnational maybe about the celebration of life, something that recognizes this was a life that was actually lived and did things. And that's there's hope in that. It can't become only that.
Right.
For me.
What other suggestions do you have any other suggestions for church leaders or people who plan or officiate at funerals, and how we balance that with the celebration of life? Yeah,
that's, it's hard. It's in some ways harder than I expected it to be. So we had Dad's funeral 3 weeks ago, and it was a real blessing to have been working on this project and thinking through it, and then talking, especially with my brother, about it. He and I did the funeral together, and I thought we achieved a pretty good balance there. Ronnie did the eulogy, basically. And I thought he did a bang-up job, and then I tried to place sort of all of that, this life lived, in the context of the life that matters. And I think so you just want to find that balance, make sure that no one should leave the funeral wondering whether or not this church ever hears the gospel, right? Yeah. It should be so infused with the gospel that that's what you have. Yeah. So I would say, so long as you bear that goal in mind, that the purpose of the funeral, you've got these sociological functions and all that stuff, but theologically, really what it is it's just commending a life to God in the gospel. And I love that there's some lines out of the Book of Common Prayer. It's funny, I held up pretty well through the funeral, but the graveside got me. And partly it's that, recognize a sheep of your own fold, And that's what you're doing. You're commending a sheep of the fold to the shepherd. So make sure you do that.
Yeah. That's good. Well, I think we'll wrap it up. Todd, thank you for this conversation. Yeah, and I know it's a hard conversation, and as you said, it's sort of fresh, a lot of this, but it's maybe also a good time to think through it and talk about it. And I hope this is helpful for you listeners. Thank you for listening to Theological Table Talk. This is part of what we do at Center for Christian Studies. Our aim is to make good theological and biblical resources accessible to churches. And so this podcast is just one very small part of this. So check out our website at christian-studies.org and take a look at all the things we do. And for this podcast, if you have any suggested topics or guests that you would like to see here, let us know. Shoot us an email at info@christian-studies.org. And especially if you like what you see on the website or what you've heard here on this episode, find that give button on our website. It shouldn't be too hard to find there, and make a tax-deductible donation to the Center for Christian Studies. Well, thanks for joining us at the table for Theological Table Talk.